Q&A. So first of all, thank you all very, very much for joining us, and it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to welcome back former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, currently chair of SIPRI, Jan Eliasson, as our keynote speaker this afternoon in conjunction with the launch of International Ideas Report on the global state of democracy, exploring democracy's resilience, which is available in a somewhat compressed version right here and in a much longer version, which is also available online. And many thanks to our co-organizer here, Massimo Tomasoli from IDEA. And this report was written entirely by his research staff and is just excellent and very incisive and thoughtful. It's not just a kind of a run-off piece of paper. So everybody in this room obviously knows that democratic institutions and values are under attack in many parts of the world. All you have to do is read the morning newspaper every morning, and you know that. But it's also true that democratic institutions are being vigorously supported and defended, and not least by the United Nations, with which Jan worked for many, many years, and which many of you are involved with, and SIPRI, as well as by all of you who are in the audience. And you've also been staunch defenders of democracy and its ideals for many decades. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. So as you all know, Ambassador Eliasson served for 10 years until this last January as United Nations Deputy Secretary General. But he has a career that goes back at the UN at least 30 years, if I'm not mistaken, and I met you quite a while ago, which is just great to see you again here in New York. So Jan played a mediation role in the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, the early 1980s. He was the first UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. That whole position was created with you to take it on. He was president of the UN General Assembly in 2005, 2006. He was Sweden's Minister for Foreign Affairs in 2006. And recently he's become the head of SIPRI, which stands for the Swedish
Stockholm International Peace Research Institute.
Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Voila. So it seems to me, I was reflecting on this, that Ambassador Eliasson has been a really steady voice for reason and sensibility and thoughtfulness in the midst of much anti-democratic threats and behavior on all continents. And you've been a voice of reason in all of that facing the UN and all of us. So he's going to share with us this afternoon some of his insights on what can be done now and in the future to assure the continued vitality and strength of our democratic institutions, which I've already said are under attack today. So he's going to discuss the challenges ahead and I think offer some suggestions on perhaps what all of you and the UN can do. So let's give him a big hand.
Thank you very much, John, for this introduction and reading out this CV, which was a gentle reminder of my age. Thank you. Glad to be back. It's my first time back at the UN and here at the IPI since I left New York 11 months ago. A friend of mine who is no longer my friend said that you are returning to the place, the scene of the crime. I thought that wasn't fair, but I did my best during my 5 years as Deputy Secretary. And it's great to be with you. I feel very much at home here at IPI. IPI was always, and is always, and Warren, I look at you, a place for breathing space, a place for reflection, a place to meet people from other, corners of the society, not only UN, but also governments and also civil society and the scientific and academic community. I see even my former colleagues here. I will recognize some of you here in the room. Great to see you, my dear. and also the private sector. And I think we need those meeting places. It has to do also with the vitality of democracy, that we bring in as many actors as possible to shape our societies. So good, it's good to be back, and I will leave my notes aside and just think aloud with you on a couple of the framing matters that I think should be kept in mind before we listen to Victoria from IDEA present in a very structured manner the analysis. And I'm really impressed, I can tell you, by this study, this global report. It's going to come out every second year. I almost assure you that it will be in the future playing the same role as hopefully CIPRI's yearbook, which is a classic piece coming out from CIPRI. And maybe you copied our idea, but it's a great presentation, and watch how they have defined the elements that build democracy. And that is important, because in the end of my presentation here, I will say that the challenge now is for us to increase, John, the resilience of democracy, make sure that we are not shaky in this moment of time that you mentioned. But first of all, let me say, and this will be spelled out by Victoria, basically the report is good news, because they are taking a perspective back to 1975, proving that in fact there is great good statistics about numbers of democracy, also the degree of participation, checks and balances on governments. Yes, it's really good news. So I want you to keep that in mind, basically good news. But we have bumps in the road, we have challenges, we have even some dangerous tendencies that we have to watch for and watch out for right now. Also in established democracies in Europe and North America. So let's then look at those challenges and those obstacles and those vibrations in the ground that I would like to bring about. I have been advocating for prevention since 25 years back in the Swedish government and back here in the UN, in my different functions. But the word prevention is so worn out practically that I am now renaming prevention to listen to the vibrations. Listen to the vibrations. The dangers that are there and that we now in the year 2017 should pick up and build upon and do something about. I could give you a long list, but I don't want to take away the impression that basically is good news. But let me still name a few things that I think we should be aware of and do something about. First point is the shrinking space of civil society in many countries, including some democracies, and the shrinking space for opposition parties, and the shrinking space for dissidents. These groups are in several places in great danger, even physically. And it is a sort of a creeping phenomenon. It poisons the democratic quality of a society. And by that, you create frustrations and tensions in a society. So watch out for that, even in democracies. Secondly, media. Under attack, journalists being both killed, wounded, brought to prison, tortured, all over the world, practically. No, maybe not all over the world, but in far too many places. The statistics of people, of journalists who died in mission and died because of their reporting is now, since 2005, close to, believe it or not, 1,000. 1,000 journalists have been killed, approximately, since the year 2000. Most of them national, local people, but also a pretty sizable group of international journalists. We know that, of course, some of your and our colleagues and friends. And that is, of course, a way for power to say, we don't want to have you see the realities in our country. And they want to scare us out. People don't dare go to ISIS-controlled areas or go to Chechnya during the worst part of that crisis. So there were no witnesses. So the problems didn't exist because there were no pictures. That was the logic. Thirdly, there is a streak of authoritarian tendencies creeping into so many parts of the world right now. Democracy to many countries and people in Africa, Asia isn't the best thing to show up. They look at the results of elections in this country and Europe and everywhere and say, well, why should we go that road? How much can you brag about? And instead, why don't we have a strong leader? And look at that, they are doing well in this huge country, China, for instance, or whatever a country that is run by these authoritarian leaders. And then, step after step, democracy is undermined. And we should be listening to those vibrations when the space for actually a living democracy is being reduced. Then, of course, there is something which I really think we need to be aware of, and John, you hinted at it. And that is the trust deficit that we see growing in the world. People don't trust their leaders, whether it is in government or in parliament, or even in the business world and in the organizations, the authorities, because they see promises that are not kept, they see corruption, they see in the private sector tax evasion, and they feel a rage within themselves that will have to go somewhere. And it goes in the direction of simple solutions. A populism that takes the shape of dividing society into us and them, where the us is always better than the them. And when that happens, be careful, that's a dangerous vibration. Then you actually start to slide and be uncertain about everybody's equal worth. UN Charter Preamble. First page. It's there. This is my 14th version. Tomorrow I have to get a new one in the UN, because this is really worn out now. That's the price I pay for not visiting the UN. So, yeah, well, I'll get one tomorrow from the secretary of the DSG. Anyway, so this trust deficit we have to take seriously, because in that trust deficit, you have also political tendencies growing that polarize our societies in Europe and in this country. And therefore, we have to make sure that we bring out the elements of democracy that produce results, and that we require pretty sternly and toughly, in a tough way, the requirements of honesty and strong and healthy institutions. So, what do we then do to increase the resilience, to make sure that our democracies turn stronger? First of all, I think we should remember that you have been also part of the UN process. As I look around the room, several of you have worked on these factors, is that we have to remember the formula that was adopted 2005 when I was President of the General Assembly. Shamina was there. The formula of there's no peace without development. Have you ever heard it? But there's no development without peace. And remember, none of the above without respect of human rights and honest institutions and rule of law. That's those three pillars. If one of those pillars is weak, the whole structure is weak. Everything falls apart. If there's war, there's no development. Look at Syria and vice versa. Development, peace. And if you don't have human rights respected, society is on a very shaky ground. In other words, we have to work on peace, security, development, human rights at the same time. It's a huge task. But we have the tool. By that formula, Warren, that was accepted in September 2005. You were here for the New York Times at the time. And that formula is still the basis. These are the three pillars. And I know Antonio Guterres is quite aware that these have to be strengthened, all three of them. The second thing is you also have been involved in this, many of you, the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals are really a very important step forward. I was around even for the MDGs. And at that time, only one of the 8 goals of the MDGs related to the rich countries, the so-called developed countries. I've stopped talking about developed and developing. I think we're all developing countries. But anyway, the rich countries, they were not part of that, those goals. The 7 of the 8 goals were directed to the poor countries, to put it simply. But now, these 17 goals are universal. We have to, when it comes to sustainability, take on the responsibility, all of us, for those goals. And those goals are not only strictly talking about development, they're also talking about peace and human rights. Goal 16 talks about peaceful societies, but also inclusive and transparent and strong institutions. So you reach out both to peace, development, and human rights in the SDGs. It's a historically important step. And these goals are mutually reinforcing. It sounds like a bureaucratic term, but what I mean is that if you do it right on one thing, it goes well on other sides. I'm particularly interested, as you know, in water. And if you do water and sanitation right, then you have effects on child mortality, on women's health, on education, on gender equality, on extreme poverty. 5 other goals of the MDGs were connected to this, and same thing for these goals. So it's a beautiful tool that you also, as civil society, many of you and member states, contributed to. So congratulations for that. And then there's a new term that has come up recently, which you should really try to work harder on and make it known. It's sustaining peace. Namely that peace is something that goes from the stage of prevention into the conflict itself and the post-conflict stage. And in the work for sustaining peace, you need to have both preventive action during the crisis and post-conflict. And if you do post-conflict right, it's actually prevention. And that means also you got to be mobilized. If these goals are to be, in the end, reached, you need to have private sector, civil society, scientific community, academic world on board. So here is a very important tool. Let me be personal on one point. No, on 2 points, if I may. 2 points. The first one is institutions. I grew up in Gothenburg, Sweden. My father had 7 years of school. My mother had 4 years of school in a country village south of Gothenburg. My aunt, aged 19, died of tuberculosis, starvation practically. I grew up in one room. I saw my first bathroom at age 10. We had cold water coming from a thing that we turned on. I was the first one to graduate from even high school. When I graduated from high school, my father and I talked. He took me aside, very proud to have produced the first graduate in family's history, on both sides, mother and father. And I said to him, thank you very much. You have supported us so strongly. You have put us under horrible expectations, my brother and me, but thank you. And then I asked him, what was it that brought Sweden to be, which was then in the 30s, I was born 1940, was then one of the most poor countries in Europe. Sweden was among the 5 poorest countries in Europe in the 20s and 30s. Norway also, Finland. And he said 3 things, my son. We built infrastructure. We took loans to build roads, railroads, schools, hospitals, which later constituted the good public sector. Secondly, we insisted on a fair education system. And that's what you profited from. Fair, not 1 krona to be paid for your studies from grade 1 to your university degree, which is still the policies at home. But then the third point, which is relevant for this discussion. He said, we trusted the people who were sitting in the city government in the province government, in Stockholm, in the capital, in the institutions. We trusted them, and damn it, if they didn't act honestly, if there was the slightest sense that they didn't think correctly, they were thrown out. Oh my God, I said, this is it. So I think this is actually a recipe for a good world, that we insist on building a society which produces results for people, which gives everybody a fair chance, but also that we can trust institutions and that we can trust the people who are there. And with this trust deficit we have today, this is an urgent task. So I think the resilience we have to work and make sure that we now in this critical moment, I think it is critical. I think we will look back at the year 2017 and you will be asked by your children and grandchildren and friends, what did you do 2017? Because you saw the signs. You saw the vibrations in your own societies. What did you do? And there we need to be more tough, more muscular, more decisive, standing up for these good forces. And to make it easy for ourselves, reread the UN Charter's first page, the preamble. You could also reread recommended reading, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I feel like a magician here. There's a quote from Hammarskjöld that I can read, which I won't. And these human rights, remember, apropos democracy, are not only civil and political rights. These rights are also economic, social, and cultural. They are truly universal. Human rights and democracy must not become a Western Northern notion. It should be a universal goal for all of us. So thank you very much.
Well, Jan, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much. This is really an inspirational presentation, and I had the pleasure of hearing you across the street at the UN just now, sort of sharing many of the same ideas. So we've got civil society in the room and people from the UN across the street. So we're now going to have the privilege of hearing from Victoria Perotti with a PowerPoint of 5 or 6 minutes, which will summarize the report. And please, the floor is yours. I think you're going to do.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here at IPI, presenting International Ideas Global State of Democracy publication. This is a project in which IDEA has been working for the last couple of years, and I'm very glad to share our findings with you. I would first like to very briefly talk about the Global State of Democracy's indices, which are the main empirical evidence base of the publication. The indices cover a period of 40 years, so from 1975, the third wave of democracy, to 2015, when the most recent data is available. Indeed, the indices garner 90 indicators from extant sources, and they cover 155 countries. The idea was to provide a nuanced measurement of different attributes of democracy that cannot be aggregated into one single score for each country. So let me repeat that, or reword that. We are not ranking countries. We are not providing one single score for every country. Rather, we encourage users to search beyond the single score and look into the different trends at a country, regional, and global levels in regards to democracy's attributes. And in fact, the publication uses these indices as an empirical base for the analysis of resilience and policy responses to challenges. And in this sense, the indices are a real tool for data-based policy development. So let me first start with the definition that International IDEA uses for democracy, which is based on two main pillars: popular control over decision-making and decision-makers, and political equality in the exercise of that control. We further break down these principles into 5 attributes of democracy. We have first, I can hardly see it, but so we have first representative government, which measures the traditional understanding of democracy with, for example, elections and political parties. Second, we have fundamental rights. Third, we have checks on government with the legislative and the media. Impartial administration is the fourth. which very importantly measures the absence of corruption. And last, we have an attribute that is not aggregated, which is participatory engagement. This measures, for example, to what extent do people participate in civil society organizations, and to what extent do people participate in elections. So by now, you're wondering, so what is the global state of democracy? And we learned that contrary to the many negative headlines we see in newspapers over the last years, claiming that democracy is in retreat or is in decline, indeed, democracy has been, in fact, resilient. So democracy as a social system has been able to recover, to be flexible, innovate, and adapt when facing challenges and crises. Democracy has not experienced an overall decline. I can highlight three things in this regard. Democracies have been able to bounce back. In fact, the indices show that the recent democratic regressions have generally been short and followed by rather quick recovery. This is related to what we call modern democratic backsliding. As opposed to traditional democratic backsliders, who would use a coup d'etat or voting fraud, these more modern backsliders, first, they get into power through the channels of democracy, so fairly free and fair elections. Second, they manipulate the institutions designed to balance or check the power of the executive. And third, they use the law to reduce the space of civil society and political freedoms. All this within the framework of a democratic system. But to strengthen the grip on power, note that what the modern backslider does is to manipulate rather than to abolish the democratic mechanisms and institutions. With this, they claim certain degree of legitimacy, which obviously they use in their favor, and that's true. But they also leave this a space or a seed for civil society to combat the backslider. Elections, for example, through elections or whatever is left. In that sense, this is less bad than more traditional authoritarian backsliding. These processes certainly affect key democratic attributes, such as impartial administration, fundamental rights, checks and balances, as well as other important aspects such as public order and development. But very importantly and notably, after these events of backsliding takes place, and contrary to what we assume, participatory engagement show a different trajectory, a positive one. So basically, these events do not affect participatory engagement. So local elections, civil society participation, direct democracy, and electoral participation. And in fact, democratic backsliding does not indicate a decline in popular support of democracy, but actually the opposite seems to be true. In countries experiencing modern democratic backsliding, people's positive perception of democracy as a system of government actually increased. The value that the citizens give to democracy improved after these events took place. So the third point is that there has been a global progress in all aspects of democracy. So in terms of the quality and quantity of democracies, there has been progress. Democracy remains the most widespread legitimate form of government. But let's see beyond elections. Not only has there been an increase in electoral democracies, but also according to the components of this attribute, we can see that the quality of elections is better, lower levels of fraud, manipulations, and irregularities. Next to it, we also see that there is an improvement in check and balances on government power since 1975. There is more judicial independence, freedom for the news and media to scrutinize the executive power. However, we see that there is great variation between from country to country in terms of these attributes. We also see that fundamental rights that measure whether citizens can exercise political freedoms has also improved globally, but again with great variance between countries. And the fourth attribute, participatory engagement, There has been an improvement in some countries and declines in others, and in average, a larger share of the population is politically engaged since 1975. But yes, we also see that democracy is at a crossroads. Sorry. And in fact, they are being put to test with many things that the report highlights, but I will focus only in 3 of them. The first one is increased corruption. So the only attribute of democracy that has not shown improvement over the last 40 years is impartial administration. It has an important component. Yeah, I hope you can see it. It's the yellow line, which is the absence of corruption. The indices shows that this attribute is as bad today as it was in 1975. So you can see it's a flat line. And generally, we found that in the bibliography and the data, that the more democratic governments more democratic governments are better at curbing corruption, with some precisions. The introduction of elections alone may fuel corruption, but corruption declines when the quality of elections improves, and when other checks in society and the state take root, such as freedom of expression and association and judicial control, for example. This is also connected with the role of money in politics. While money is an important resource for communicating with the constituents and generally doing politics, there are some challenges related to big money in politics. In fact, money can also disempower the majority by giving greater opportunities to a few well-funded actors. So it generates distortions through the avenues of democracy. And that leads me to the next challenge, which is increased inequality. There is grotesque levels of inequalities that the world is experiencing today. And this impacts the quality of democracy. Yes, it's true that 1.1 billion people have been lifted from extreme poverty, and that inequality between countries has declined considerably, but inequalities within countries is at a historic high. And as you know, inequalities are intersectional. It's exacerbated when a person is marginalized because of the socioeconomic position, the gender, the culture, or the color of the skin. Important to note is that there has been a shift in terms of who is at risk of extreme poverty. And so while the effect of inequalities, exclusion, and discrimination are felt in many parts of the society, they are particularly prevalent among young people. This is a shift. We also see in terms of gender that there is still high levels of inequalities in regards to women. For instance, although women representation in legislatures has more than doubled over the last 22 years, so from 11% to 23%, at this pace, it will take 40 years and to see an equal number of women and men in the parliament. In particular, these inequalities deeply affect democracy in terms of distortions in voice and representation and the legitimacy of political institutions that are perceived as corrupt or not able to deliver. This takes us to the third challenge, which is political representation. Levels of corruption and inequality, as I was saying, have affected citizens' trust in political parties and politics at large. In fact, we see 2 things here, that there is a high correlation between the trust in politicians with the absence of corruption, and 2, that certainly citizens' confidence in political parties have declined over time. In terms of political parties, we see that these challenges have also given a place to an increase in populist political parties and the rise of political movements with an anti-establishment rhetoric. Now, the last part of my presentation. I will turn the page to the last chapter of the publication too, which is about peace building and conflict-affected states. We know that democratic transitions, such as when a country first introduces elections, typically generate instability and can trigger violence. But we also know that the more democratic a country is, the less likely it is to engage in conflict. This means that while introducing democracy can generate short-term state fragility, the long-term benefit seems to outweigh these risks. However, over the last years, the world has been changing, and these changes have impacted the relationship between peace and democracy. In the past decade, wars between states have been decreasing, yet wars within states are on the rise, and these wars are also becoming deadlier. Violence is also far likelier to return, with 60% of conflicts in the early 2000s re-emerging within 5 years. In short, internal conflicts are now more frequent, deadlier, and more recurrent. Some of these findings that I mentioned before, like weak institutions and political and economic exclusion, stand out as important drivers of these conflicts. And precisely, considering the drivers of conflict, this chapter argues that inclusive post-conflict transitions are more likely to result in resilient democracies. Inclusiveness is in this sense doesn't just mean to include more people at the table. It requires giving them a real decision-making power, particularly at the local level, that in turn involves everyone in the outcomes of the process and creates institutions that are well calibrated to respond to their needs. This is a key ingredient of conflict prevention. Active and targeted inclusion promotes stability and resilience in the new democratic institutions by prioritizing communication between political elites and citizens, as well as giving voice to those marginalized groups, the most marginalized groups in society. And so we look into the issue of inclusiveness in 3 foundational processes and institutions in which international IDEA also has key expertise. These processes, which are elections, constitutions, and the political settlement, lay the foundations of the new state. They determine who can participate in that state and design the levels of that participation. In that sense, these processes can make an enormous difference in generations to come. So first, with constitutions, we consider that post-conflict constitutions are not only the framework of the government, but they also embody the peace deal. And they include, for example, the settlement of disputes related to identity, ideology, autonomy, and access to public power and resources. So unsurprisingly, these constitution-building processes take place in fiercely contested political arenas. But including interested parties from the process renders them unable to voice their concerns and aspirations, and this risks the rejection of the final document. The bottom line is that inclusion is linked to legitimacy, stability, and resilience. The chapter also discusses how to create inclusive constitution-building processes. So, research shows, in terms of political parties, or the political settlement, that including former rebels in peace-building processes make a recurrence to conflict less likely in both the short term and the long term. As such, former rebel groups play an important role in most post-conflict transitional periods, and their decisions about, I have less than that, and the decisions about whether and how to participate in electoral politics can have far-reaching consequences for the resilience of both the new state and the democratic system as a whole. However, the chapter discusses the dilemmas and challenges of including former rebels. For rebel movements, there are 3 key incentives in pursuing politics through the electoral. For example, they have financial and they would want to have financial and logistical support, a place in the table, and maybe a further legitimization of their political ideas. But on the other hand, there is a few challenges in becoming a political party. For example, they would have to change their attitudes and behaviors, and in other words, how to implement processes of internal democracy within the political parties. So importantly, with this, how can transitional agreements be designed to convince former rebels that participation in democratic politics is worth the risks? In part, this depends on the choice of the electoral system, which is the last one of the elements in this chapter. Elections are often perceived as one of the most fundamental aspects of democracy. And so citizens should have faith about the electoral system that will guarantee that their interests are being represented. Contrary to what we know, the ability of proportional representation electoral systems to include a broader cross-section of society in the legislature may have less utility to incentivize for long-term peace and stability than what we thought. Majoritarian systems, which incentivize consensus-based politics, may work better in conflict-affected states. And however, this section seeks to show the interrelation between societies, expectations, electoral systems, and other democratic institutions and processes. And the underlying message is that there has to be a careful consideration of these relations in order to establish which electoral system is the best one for the society. And this has to be left in the hands of the local communities. To conclude, in 2015, the world agreed to pursue a joint sustainable development agenda with 17 ambitious goals that range from ending poverty and hunger to promoting economic growth and clean energy consumption. The whole agenda was indeed built under the premise of leaving no one behind. And it created concrete and measurable actions to pursue inclusiveness. Notably, Sustainable Development Goal 16, which advances peace, justice, and strong institutions, commits countries to ensure inclusive decision-making at all levels. And so we hope that international idea with this publication will contribute to generating ideas and strategies for more inclusive, peaceful, and democratic societies. Thank you.
So we're going to have each panelist speak for maximum 5-6 minutes. There's 3 of them because we've already heard from Victoria. We'll then have a Q&A, all right? Only Qs, no speeches, short questions. So, because we've got a lot of folks here. So first we'll start with Sara Taylor, my colleague at IPI, our colleague, who's been working on gender issues, which were highlighted in Victoria's report. So, Sara.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to my fellow panelists and to the authors of this report. I did enjoy it. It has prompted multiple questions already on my part, which I promise I will not try to address all at once in my 5 minutes. As noted, I work on women, peace, and security at IPI, and so what I would like to do today is just to raise a couple of questions and a couple of points that came to mind as I was reading through the report today, specific to gender. I will add, I really also very much appreciated the report's strong emphasis on inclusion, including pointing out that resilient democracies require recognition of the intersection of multiple identity categories, such as disability, age, and youth, and age and gender. I also do want to preface my comments by pointing out that gender does not equal women. I will attempt to be precise in my remarks on that particular point. So what I'd like to do, as I mentioned, is I'd like to raise a few points on the complexities of gender and the intersection with certain democratic processes, as we've been discussing here today on democratic resilience. So one of the issues that is mentioned in the report, towards the end, the beginning of the report, is expectations regarding women when they're holding political office. And so this is a point that I think is that advocates, that those who are advocating for women in legislative roles and in politically elected roles, that there's going to be some kind of outcome. And what I'd like to point to is that is related to their gender. And what I'd like to point to here, amongst the many other issues that I could raise on this point, is the structural barriers that face elected female representatives once they're in office. The complexity of the need for networks, for support, the fact that, as the report rightly points out, there's often less women for female candidates. Those are all structural barriers. And as I really appreciated from the opening speaker, from Eliasson, saying, the closing space for civil society has a huge impact on this. There's been longitudinal research done by Thun and Weldon that points to the single most effective variable, or the single most important variable in the passage of legislation related to women's rights. They tracked the elimination of violence against women legislation, is the presence of a robust civil society that supports women legislators in the passage of this kind of legislation. So there's the complexity of these relationships and upending what we sort of think of as a linear expectation of what people are going to do. I think we need to complicate that a little bit. So an additional example that I would like to raise is some of the expectations around measures to dismantle barriers to women's participation in electoral processes. So, as the report noted, we have several decades, 4 decades, I believe, at this rate to go until we actually achieve gender parity. It's a very depressing number. But, you know, this is not because, you know, this inequality has prompted the development of a number of modalities, including things like special temporary measures, such as quotas. Many have done research on the different modalities here, and there's some really interesting work in this piece on this. And you know, there has been research done that indicates that there has been research done that points specifically to the impact that quotas can have in post-conflict countries recovering from conflict, on women's participation. But what I'd like to point to is the relationship between the increase of women running for office, of women participating in electoral processes by voting, and violence against women. So there's some interesting research that came out that you and I have discussed at length on the recent elections in Kenya that points to the fact that specifically ties together the Kenyan quota to increase women's participation and increase levels of violence against women. So I think that as we look at, you know, one case study does not make a trend. I don't even have 3 anecdotes to make that a trend. There's more evidence, obviously. But I do think that it's important for us to think through, as we look at dismantling long-standing institutional barriers, we need to be looking at what unintended consequences can be, and developing programming and policy that is responsive to that. So I'll just make 2 final comments. One comment is, we've already discussed briefly on the sidelines. I'd really love to get more into the data and more into the gender disaggregated data around peacebuilding. And I think that there's a lot of scope to talk about that and to bring up, when we're talking about inclusive transitional processes, what the gender data shows us there. And then finally, a question that is prompted by the report in relation to democratic backsliding. I'm wondering if there's a gender dimension to that backsliding that we can identify, and even to talk about it as an early warning system, one of the vibrations perhaps that was discussed in the opening session, which is, you know, the report notes that one of the signs of democratic backsliding is the decrease in social rights and equality. And what I'm really interested in is whether we see that specifically being made manifest in the rollback of legislation on women's rights, or the passage of legislation that constrains these rights. So I'm thinking, obviously, a point of entry here would be legislation regarding sexual and reproductive health rights. So with all of that being said, I'll close here. I will again point out that I have many more questions. I'm looking forward to discussing them in the question and answer session. And again, my congratulations to the authors of the report. Thank you.
Wait a second. So, Sara, thank you very much. And we've been discussing gender at IPI for quite a while, and having you with us adds a really new dimension to this in a very significant way. So our next speaker will be Hank Jan Brinkman, who's been very active with IPI and our Africa program for a number of years, speaking to the students from Africa. He is the Chief of Policy Planning and Application in PBSO, the United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office. So thank you very much for joining us. Hank Jan, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I also really want to commend the team of putting this report together. I think it's a really, I thought it was on, yeah, closer to the mic. It really is a magnificent report, and with a lot of facts and data that really can now provide the evidence that there is some shrinking space for civil society and some backsliding. But of course, the aspect of the resilience is very important in how we support and nurture that. I also very much like the emphasis on that democracy is not the same as elections. I think a lot of countries made that mistake in the 90s when was this big push for democracy, in particular in Africa, and that you really need the institutions that underpin a vibrant democracy, an independent media, independent judiciary, in particular when there are disputes over elections, and we have seen quite a few recently, independent election commissions, but also just political parties and parliaments and how they function, and do they have the capacity to operate in a democratic system. Also very much like the analysis on the influence of money and the negative effects of that, and the emphasis on inequality. There's one area I disagree with, and I'm going to say something about that, and that's about referendums. And one area that I think is missing, but correct me if I'm wrong, and that is identity politics. Let me first say something about referendums. I think actually it is a mistake to see referendums as something that contribute to democracy. We have seen too many very narrow rejections of very difficult issues. I think it's very difficult to phrase very complex issues in a yes or no question. And I think I elect my representative in Parliament to make these choices, to make to look at the total picture and weigh the policy options, weigh the cost and benefits, and weigh the pros and cons. And I don't think that it is easy to put that in a yes or no question. Moreover, of course, when these referendums are held, there are other issues that are at play. People vote on the people or the person who is advocating for the pro or con, not on the issue. The weather is important. Actually, that played a role in Colombia. I mean, the weather deciding whether the peace should prevail in Colombia or not. I don't think that we need to put such volatile issues, volatile events at risk on a vote on one particular day. Voters use shortcuts. They don't really vote on the issues. I do think that it is somewhat problematic, and I rather see other ways of making difficult decisions in societies. I do, of course, see that we need a very active, and I very much support the participatory approach to democracy, where every citizen has a role to play. And there are good examples of how that can work. And now with new technologies, there is many more ways to do that. Victoria mentioned constitution building. The example of South Africa was absolutely fantastic of how they changed the constitution in a very divisive environment in the 1990s. And there were 2 million comments given on the draft constitution through various means. And I think that is the way to have people weigh in on difficult issues. And then, of course, you have, referendums can work if you have a large turnout and it's with a very strong landslide victory on one side. But most often, and often the case, like in Colombia or in Brexit, you have a 45% turnout and a 51% winning. And so that means that only like 25% or so, or 20% is actually in favor of the issue. The second point that I feel is missing is identity politics. And I think that that is undermining democracies in some ways. It has the tendency to really focus on one issue. And political parties and politics is about a number of issues. Lobby groups are for one issue, but political parties need to be much broader. They need to be weigh those issues, those difficult issues, and the trade-offs, and the pros and the cons, and the costs and benefits. And we need to make sure that citizens think in broader terms, that think about society as a whole, about their fellow citizens, and not necessarily about their small, of perhaps bigger interest, but of one issue that often identity politics focus on. And I think it's particularly problematic in emerging democracies. We have seen that in Africa, for example, in the 90s, that when democracy was established, that political parties established themselves along ethnic or religious lines. And that really undermined the sense of nation building and the sense of social cohesion and national identity rather than group identity. And it also, of course, makes politics much more vulnerable to political entrepreneurs who take or try to take benefit out of making identity an issue in elections. And finally, maybe say a few words on the UN World Bank study that very much is in line with some of the comments of Victoria on the report. The first companion report was presented in September by the Secretary General and President of the World Bank. The bigger report are actually being finalized when we speak and will be presented in March. But one of the very most important conclusions in that report is that exclusion is one of the most important drivers of violent conflict. And that exclusion in political terms, so I very much like the definition about political equality as a very important aspect of the definition of democracy. So political exclusion in political, social, or economic terms are very important drivers. And of course, especially when these three are combined. And that those exclusions are often the reasons why people mobilize and polarize in societies, and then group identity starts to play a role. So political leaders or entrepreneurs try to take advantage of that and argue that some groups are excluded, even if they're not actually. So it's a lot about perceptions of exclusion as much as it is about factual exclusion as well. So being the vibration that Jan talked to is very important in that regard, that you monitor that exclusion and monitor the possible mobilization that takes place because certain groups are excluded. And that is in particular in danger if that exclusion is by ethnicity or religion or region or you name it. So I'll leave it here. Maybe to end with a quote of Ibsen, I think is very appropriate in this room, that the majority has might on its side, but right has it not. Thank you.
Well, Henk Jan, thank you very much. I think that all these points here show how important this report is because it's raising these questions. And as you all think about what you want to ask, you can reflect on that. We've had referendums, identity politics, perceptions of exclusion, the role of women, whether we got to wait 40 years for equality to reach our governance. So our last speaker here is Thomas Garrett. I think we're going to say goodbye to you, Jan. Let's give him a big round of applause.
One aspect that I hope that you will also cover is the situation for migrants or refugees.
Okay, right.
And also for the cohesion of a society, identify rights of, let's say, indigenous populations, and as you said, the exclusion being then a reason for even, you know, people go in the direction of separatism or even worse. So there was a Swedish prime minister that I worked with who said that if you want to measure the quality of society, look at how that society deals with those most suppressed, most vulnerable, the poorest. That's where you get the quality of a cohesive society. So I am sorry I have another engagement, but it's great to be with you.
Thank you very much.
IPI is a great institution. Thank you. And UN also.
Thank you. So with that, let's turn this over to Mr. Garrett, Thomas Garrett, the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies, and then we will have a round of questions or comments. Go ahead.
All right, thank you,
Questions.
Mr. Hirsch. As you say, it is an important report, and on behalf of the Community of Democracies, I want to thank International IDEA for this very important body of work, which provides us with a tool, a guide to respond to the challenges facing democracy today. Populism, extremism, voter alienation, these are all internal challenges to democracy today, along with corruption and the marginalization of groups. Externally, democracies are facing new challenges, security challenges, and terrorism. And as Mr. Eliasson referred to, migration flows, things that it hasn't had to deal with before. We see today some of the least democratic nations on earth threatening democratic neighbors in the region, with North Korea threatening the Republic of Korea, threatening Japan, and as we saw in the last 24 hours, the United States. We see Russia inside of Ukraine. We see Russia intimidating its Baltic neighbors. And so we do see that there is a challenge to democracy that's real, it's global, it's internal, it's external, and in some cases it's existential for some of these countries. When the Community of Democracies was founded back in 2000, it was a very different environment. And there was a moment of optimism there. 107 nations came together in the year 2000, including Russia, including Azerbaijan, including Egypt, including any number of countries that today may actually be in some places examined in reports such as this. So much of that optimism from 2000 has been tempered. It's even been questioned in the last 17 years. One of the things that the report points out that I think we should all take some hope in is that democracy is still the principal form of government for the world's citizens. We see changes within some countries that concern us, changes to constitutions, threats to media freedom, attempts to limit checks and balances, but in the whole, electoral democracies themselves haven't declined. We still have some 123 or so countries that meet the definitions of electoral democracy. One of the things the report notes is that 56% of the countries that democratized since 1975, when the indices are first counted, have remained democratic. I think in earlier remarks that I made today, I was probably a little bit more optimistic than maybe I am towards the end of the day here. Adina spoke earlier about the glass half full, the glass half empty, the glass being 2/3 full. And as I've listened to some incredibly learned people today, both at the previous panel and this one, I would just say that perhaps my optimism is somewhat tempered. The democracy community has been on the defensive for a few years now. And so the report came as a welcome relief to us because it gives us a proactive measures to look at. It gives us the idea of collective engagement among democratic nations to try to protect the integrity of democracy. But one of those things is we see 56% of the countries since 1975 have remained democratic. 68% of the world's population live in systems where there is genuine electoral competition. You know, I have to say, you get very dismayed, though, when you see that since 1975, corruption and lack of impartial governance has not changed at all in 40 years. And this is something that I think at the community of democracies we're going to want to take a much deeper and sober look at as we gather our governing council again, because corruption is something that more and more I think is affecting the lives of average men and women, and they're beginning to realize that. So I won't be totally non-optimistic. I actually spoke to a former US Secretary of State this week, and we were talking about these very issues, and I said, am I being too optimistic? When I see suddenly the types of people being elected to office in the United States in the last few months. I see the numbers of people who are participating in protest in the streets of Europe against governments that they believe are infringing upon their freedoms. And this former Secretary of State said to me, no, I'm also an optimist, but I worry a lot. And I think that's probably where we ought to be with a report such as this. We can take some real encouragement from what we see and hear and read, but we need to understand this is not going to be easy. If something hasn't changed in 40 years as one of these key indicators, then that gives us a little bit of an idea of the challenge that's ahead. So let me just kind of conclude by talking about what are the main challenges ahead. These are not in any particular order, but these are some of the things I feel are very important out there. One is ensuring that democracy and human rights are a part of the global dialogue on security. Terrorism is a great threat to democracies. It's a great threat to the world order. Yet I think we're seeing in too many countries anti-terror laws are actually being used against NGOs that are very much an expression of women's rights, of indigenous rights, of average citizens trying to break inequality barriers. And so we need to make certain that democracy and security is not seen as a different track, a subsidiary track to security, but is certainly there at that table. Secondly, there's a very clear connection, I think, between democracy and civil society, an unbreakable connection. In recent years, some 120 laws have been passed that repress civil society in some 60 countries. Mr. Eliasson has spoken about the vibrations. I can tell you that from work I had done in the past in the Middle East, when the Arab Spring occurred, the US government did a report to try to understand how did it totally miss the Arab Spring. And if you go back and look at embassy cables, if you go back and look at official pronunciations, President Ben Ali is here to stay. President Mubarak of Egypt, when he goes, he'll turn it over to his son. There is no change. And instead, the US found itself, I think, really unprepared to support the people of the Middle East and their democratic aspirations. So what I would say is when we listen to vibrations, let's listen to vibrations from civil society. And that's why we have to protect this space and make certain that they're not isolated in their country, that they're still engaging at a global level. Just two last quick things. One is when we see transitions in places like Tunisia, which has continued to be one of the bright spots out of the Arab Spring, which is a story that's not over, in my opinion. Transitions like Ukraine, Tunisia, those have important implications for regional democracy, and they must be supported by other democratic nations. And then finally, it's bringing marginalized groups into the process. And I think in too many of the established democracies, the idea that there was a precipitous decline always in voter participation didn't seem to worry the people in office. It just seemed to be, this is something we have to calculate in maximizing our turnout and winning an election. And instead, I think we need to see this as an existential threat to democracy, and we need to make certain that every member of society who's entitled to do so is participating or has the opportunity to participate in democracy. So those are just some of the things I wanted to touch on from the report and from what I've heard today, and look forward to talking to you.
Well, these are terrific points. Thank you very much. You know, I want to, as a sort of a parentheses, sort of make the comment that all these refugees want to enter democratic countries. I don't know a single refugee who's trying to enter an authoritarian country. So you could say it's only for jobs and so on, but that's a kind of a reality. They're all going to Germany or Western Europe or the United States, Sweden, Europe. They're not going to Asia. So you got to think about that. Why do these people want to go to those countries and not to other countries? And it has a lot to do, it seems to me, with democracy and openness and opportunity, also economic opportunity, obviously. So I want to take one round of questions and or a very, very brief comment, and then let the panel answer it, and then I'm going to wrap it up. So if you would like to ask a question, not a speech, please, if you would identify yourself and your organization, and you've got the mic here, this gentleman here, and if anybody else wants to ask a question, why don't you identify yourself?
Thank you. I'm Dennis Fredo with the Lutheran World Federation, representative here at the UN. I wanted to ask whether the report discusses the impact of social media on democracy, and if not, do you anticipate doing that in subsequent reports?
Yeah, that's really an important question, because social media is all over the place. Many more people apparently hear Trump on Twitter than read the New York Times by a factor of 10 to 1 or something. Would somebody else like to ask a question here? Are you all totally satisfied with everything you've heard? Please.
Yeah, Shamina de Gonzaga, World Council of Peoples for the UN. So what strikes me is that there seems to be a consensus, and everybody talks about the shrinking space for civil society, and not at all to dismiss the value of the messages and the reports, but there's, I'm not hearing anything surprising or new. It's good that it's there and that it's there to inform people, but I'm curious, given that there are a lot of reports of different organizations concur on these very messages, is there any thought as to actual strategies for addressing that? And of course, we're talking about vibrations and voices from the ground, but we continue very often to work within insulated environments to which most people have no access. So the gentleman who mentioned bringing in marginalized groups, that's still very tokenistic in most settings. I'd love to hear some concrete ways in which you think one should go about rectifying that.
Great question. Anybody else? We put out a report today, IPI, on the status or the crisis of all these migrants in Libya, and essentially nobody's helping them, in a nutshell. There's no Libyan government. It's all fractured. So it underscores the point you asked. Anybody else want to ask a question here? Are you all? So the lady there, please. Why don't you stand up and say your name, please.
My name is Nandita Sharma, and I'm from Columbia University. I'm a psychology student, and my question specifically is for Ms. Sara Taylor. So leaders all over the world have spoken about a change in mindset of people regarding gender roles, right? But are there any researches that have, and you spoke about mobilizing the support of the society and the civil society. So are there any studies that have actually identified the values and the beliefs that are held in the society? And if not, then what can be the scope of identification of these values towards change?
So the civil societies have a real impact, is sort of what I got out of your question.
I'm talking about the views, values, attitudes, and perceptions that are held in the civil society, and whether we can identification of them to bring about a change, because you speak about like vaguely about change in mindset, but what is the mindset we're talking about?
Sure. Okay. So let's go back to the panel. Sarah, why don't you start? We'll stay in the order we would. Would you like to say something? Yeah, we'll come to you in a minute. Sarah.
Great. So I'll just address two civil society points, I think. Just to your point, I mean, I can't cite offhand that kind of sort of how you phrased it, views, values, perceptions of the civil society organizations writ large, if there's been that kind of study done. The civil society, when I was speaking about the value and the importance of civil society, that connection between representatives in a government and a robust civil society that's specifically looking at civil society organizations that are focused on women's rights. So it's like women-led and women-focused civil society organizations that work strategically and in support of and with legislators who are trying to get specific women's rights legislation adopted. I think, I won't get into it now, but I think that you flag an important point, which is that civil society is broad and diverse and not always on the same page. In fact, often not on the same page as each other. So there's tremendous diversity. We shouldn't be lumping civil society as one thing. And I think, when you talk about shrinking civil society space and avoiding tokenistic representation of civil society organizations in various processes or attacks on civil society, I think the point on women and what needs to be done, the point on civil society and on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism efforts, women's organizations have been raising the red flag about this issue for years. And what we're finally seeing is data and evidence on the impact of the financing elements of this CT legislation and the disproportionate and detrimental impact that it's having on local grassroots women's organizations and their ability to do life-saving work like humanitarian service provision. And what's the response in order to support them? A much closer look at how these laws are being used to target groups and coincidental and unintended consequences, and a little bit more political support at the international level would be great too.
So Victoria, why don't you come on in here, and then Hank Jan, and then we'll come back to Mr. Garrett, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I was thinking about the two questions. One was if the report discusses the impact of social media and in democracy. And I think to some extent is underlined it's something that is discussed briefly in some of the chapters, but certainly that's a very interesting aspect that we have been discussing in the production of the report, and probably or hopefully will be addressed in the future. And with regards to the shrinking space of civil society and strategies for addressing that, actually the report, by identifying how participatory engagement reacted, also the support for democracy reacted to these events of backsliding, that gives you already some entry points or ideas of what are the strategies that you should follow. And in fact, the report for every chapter indeed identifies actions for democracy assistance providers, for political parties, for policymakers, for regional organizations. So the whole idea was actually that, to put more emphasis on what then can we do about these challenges rather than just identifying the challenges. Thank you.
That's great. Hank Jan, please.
Just one point with maybe two sub-points. The first thing, responding to some of the questions about the role of social media and the shrinking space of civil society, is the importance of building coalitions for social change. I think that is really critical that and that involves not only civil society but also the people themselves. And if you look at the history of nonviolent movements, you can see that actually individual citizens really played an important role in certain actions. And I think, social media can never replace, I think, the person-to-person contacts. There was this great debate at one point between Clay Shirky and Malcolm Gladwell about the role of social media in Arab Spring, etc. And he made the point that the people who sat at the lunch counter in Georgia, I'm not in America, it was Georgia, right?
No, North Carolina.
They have been debating this issue. They were living together in the dorms, and they have debating these issues night after night in their dorms. And they were committed to do this and risk their lives only because they had that incredible bond with each other. And you can create these bonds, in my views, through social medias. So I think building these coalitions of different groups of different citizens and position yourself and advocate certain issues is really critical in my view. Thanks a lot.
So, Mr. Garrett, please.
Thank you. On social media, I'll just say that I can remember some 2 decades ago, or when social media really began to take root, people in the democracy world saw this as, boy, this is a death knell for the dictators and the authoritarians. These old dinosaurs won't know what to do with this new medium. And instead it was seen as something like, and this is a wonderful avenue to find isolated reformers in authoritarian countries and connect them to the bigger world. And totally missed was the idea that the bad guys would be able to subvert social media the way it is. And I feel like, again, back to this idea of we've been on the defensive in the democracy community for the last couple of years. If you Google democracy today, you get decline, you get backsliding, you get recession. And so this is one of those areas where we need to stop being so defensive and go on to become proactive, and to use it to spread those kinds of messages, and to use it to make certain that it's, again, connecting people who have these shared ideas. If we look at the report, the large number of people in this world share these democratic values, and we just need to make certain social media is there for them, because it does still connect a lot of isolated people with a bigger world. And then just on civil society, and it's fascinating because when you try to engage civil society in dialogues, when you try to bring them into something like the community of democracies, where do you start and where do you stop? Civil society is such a large organism, living organism, breathing thing. And we're going through a review process now where we're asking member states of the community to reapply, recommitting themselves to the original Warsaw Declaration principles of 17 years ago. And then civil society within that country is going to also weigh in on their adherence, the government's adherence to the Warsaw Declaration. And we're having a problem saying, well, then who is civil society? Because if it's certain groups in one country, probably no problem. If it's broadened to include LGBTI groups in a country, it's very possibly in a lot of Eastern European countries, a very big problem. And so it's just something that one commits to, you strive towards, you never stop prioritizing its engagement. That's it.
So just a very brief comment. I think what makes this report so strong and so good is its kind of its breadth and its depth. So much of the comment in the papers is this very short term, you know, what happened last night and what's the reaction to it, or last week, you know, and we've been bombarded with all these Twitter stuff, particularly in this country, which sort of really derogates from looking at the bigger picture, takes it away, makes everything unimportant except, you know, what the president thinks overnight comes to his mind, you know, which preoccupies him, and then he throws this out on Twitter. But of course, the report is the antithesis of that. The report takes a very long look at how all these ideas of democracy have evolved, that most people, as you've said in this report, want to be in democracies. I said it earlier, I don't see people running to authoritarian countries. I don't see anybody running to an authoritarian country, no matter how miserable they are where they may happen to be. So therefore, the challenge falls on the Europeans in particular, and so on. So on behalf of everybody here, I really want to thank you, Massimo. You want to say something before we wrap it up? Over to you.
And as a wrap-up, so I just
wondered
why you were wrapping up.
Did I ignore that? Okay.
Maybe I missed something. No, I just wanted to say what are my takeaways from this meeting and actually from this day. There were very specific comments, especially on the role of referendums, identity politics from Ankian. The comments by Sara on civil society engagement with parliamentarians in support of legislative reform and also implementation. And I wanted also to stress the point made by Tom about the outlook for democracy assistance. And so let me give you my own reflections on this quickly. I will be quick, not as politicians used to say. First of all, I think that referendums may be manipulated as they often are at the national level. In addition to the challenges posed by your analysis, Ken, there is also the fact that quite often a question put to a referendum is not actually what people are voting on. And we had the example, the paramount example was Brexit, where the question was about one topic, and in fact it was hijacked by an internal domestic politics about migration. Very little to do, as we will see after Brexit, with what they voted about, actually. So yes, referenda are things that need to be better understood and managed, and definitely they cannot substitute for working effective political party systems in representative democratic institutions. Maybe this is a point that we could continue to address in future iterations of these exercise. Identity politics is equally important in the report. Maybe probably you look at the positives in the report, because what is there is really a plea for a multidimensional approach, comprehensive consideration of issue-based politics rather than identity-driven politics. And in fact, when it comes to the analysis of populism, you can read between the lines that populism in a very evil way can be hijacked by identity-based politicians in vulnerable, conflict-prone countries. So I think that analysis is there, probably more on the positive than on the negative. And what you said, Sara, is key, very, very important. I think that we should rethink, as we used to do maybe some 20 years ago, the concept of public. What is a public space? Public space does not belong only to formal institutions, to the space of parliaments. In fact, even there is an intersection and an interface between these strong publics and other publics where civil society institutions play a great role. And in fact, on gender equality and advancing the agenda, especially on what you said, reproductive rights, for example, you may see the importance of that interface working. When we talk about shrinking space, probably that is one of the weakest links that is targeted first with legislation that restricts access, voice, and the capacity to address issues in a strong public by these other actors. Then, Tom, your point about democracy, recession, if you look at the literature over the last 15 years, you may see that already 15 years ago, I would say after September 11, there was already a lot of worry about recession. And in fact, it was about the securitization of agendas, including the development agenda, definitely the one about democracy assistance. And in fact, 17 years ago, there was also a reference to democracy in these rhetoric about the war on terrorism. And that has damaged a lot the work of those who work in supporting democracy. In fact, they were identified with an idea of exporting democracy, I would say on the tip of bayonets almost. There was really a very, very bad reputation for those who worked in our field. And in fact, before talking about democracy backsliding, in the literature about 5 years ago, you can see that they are talking about democracy assistance backsliding, the backsliding of those who provide support in order to strengthen democratic institutions and processes. I think that we have learned from that. The attitude is, in my view, positive, because we are becoming more aware of that, but the threats and the challenges that you stressed are all present and relevant. And thank you for your comments. Finally, on the general issue, why is this conversation relevant to the UN agendas? I would like to talk again about what Jan introduced in his remarkable introduction to this event. I think that all the agendas of the UN that are now on the table, out there, discussed across the street at the UN, they're all about transformation. The 2030 agenda is defined as a transformative agenda. Sustaining peace is about transforming the approach, the mindset that has been used in the past to managing violent conflict in order to focus more on what functions in terms of peace dynamics and learn from that so that we don't focus only on countries that are actually emerging from conflict or are vulnerable to conflict, but we learn also from the peaceful examples. And I think that the IPI here is trying to address that dimension so that conflict is not really hijacking the conversation on peace building. And also the migrants and refugees agenda that was mentioned by Jan Eliasson while leaving the room. I think that cannot be but a transformative agenda. There are comfortable situations or perceptions of comfortable situations that are being threatened by this exodus, which is not only about refugees, it's also about migrants. It is also beyond the migrants and refugees. It's about movement of people within their own countries. So internally displaced people. And this is a very sensitive issue that member states at the UN don't want to address, even in the Global Compact on Migrants and Refugees. And they are so important. They are disenfranchised in political and electoral terms. They are disenfranchised without even leaving their country because their electoral district is somewhere where they can go. They cannot go because there is their conflict or they would be targeted. So this is important. It is important also in the international dimension because diasporas play a role in their countries of origin, which could be also very negative indeed. And all of these should be taken into account by the member states across the street, across First Avenue. It is actually something that they know very well, and it is very difficult for them to address it. Why? Because short-term politics is driving decisions, and short-term politicians are successful. And those who are able to mobilize around some identities, consensus, electoral consensus, they are going to win. But they are not going to win in the long term. That is something that should be better understood. I think this report is pointing at the long-term dimension. 40 years, very difficult to figure it out when we have only maybe 1 year or 2 years ahead of us. But that is the impact. 40 years from now, what will this world look like? It is something that depends on the things that are being decided now. And this is a key message. I want also to thank Marisol Perez-Tello, who attended the previous meeting and made very important comments about inclusion and exclusion of indigenous peoples. How good can we consider a democracy that excludes structurally important elements of their own society just because of these pretended homogeneity and identity? This is really another comment that I think is relevant to our conversation. Frankly, I think that during the discussion on the 2030 agenda, many countries wanted to stress the concept of policy space. They wanted to widen policy space. And they referred to this widening of policy space in international negotiations. Now, there should be, I think, consistency between those who argue in favor of widening the policy space at the international level and the fact that that policy space, which is about democracy, is protected and widened at the national level. And if that would work even a little bit, I think that the key messages of this report would have actually gone through, across the street of First Avenue. Thank you very much.
So, Massimo, thank you for these remarks. And again, your team has written this report and published it. So you've done a massive job of bringing these issues forward. And your remarks just now would really be the basis for another meeting, it seems to be. So thanks all of you for being here. Let's give the panel a big hand.